Vignette number 38 from Zen Is Right Here, Teaching Stories and Anecdotes of Shunryu Suzuki. During a break on the fourth day of a sesshin at Tassajara, I stood on the bridge overlooking the creek. It was a beautiful fall day. The leaves on the trees were all vibrating and alive, and I could see energy coursing through everything. Suzuki Roshi came by, looked in my eyes and said, "Stay exactly like that." That was Jerry Fuller, Tassajara, circa 1968. Now that's the opposite from what Suzuki usually said. People would come to Suzuki and say, "Oh, I had this great experience, blah, blah, blah." And, he'd see his main interest was in seeing that they weren't attached to it. And he'd say, "Oh, that's nice," or, "Yeah, very good. What else is new?" But, because he could see they were attaching to it, so he always deflected people off of attaching to any sort of peak experience they'd had, because the tendency is for people to want to go back there to experience it again. But the last thing that's going to make you go back there is wanting to go back there and trying to go back there. But in this case, he passed Jerry, and Jerry wasn't attached to it. He was having the experience. So Suzuki said, "Yeah, that's it. Just do that. Just be that way." Jerry. We lost Jerry about, I don't know, 20 years ago or something. He was a little bit older, maybe 5 years older than a lot of us. Probably if he were alive today, he'd be 80. He'd been a merchant marine quite a bit, and a high mountain climber, the type where people die. He said he'd had a lot of friends but die. And he was of the skilled carpenters at Tassajara and at Zen Center at Green Gulch and Tassajara mainly. Paul Disco, Nils Holm, Ken Sawyer, and Jerry Fuller. That's who I thought of as the four. They were the four. There were other really good carpenters, but they were the four I thought of as being the most experienced. I interviewed him on August 25th, 1995, in San Rafael, where Elin and I were living then. And I say, Jerry Fuller was a much-beloved Zen student, carpenter, mountain climber, and practitioner of tea ceremony. Oh, yes, I shouldn't leave that out. My gosh, he went to Japan. I'd see him in Japan. And he was at the Urasenke school. I think that's the right one to say. He was in the bigger school of Zen, of tea ceremony, Chado, the way of tea. And I remember I was showing David Rockefeller Jr. and his wife, God, what was her name? It's been a while. Around Kyoto, some people had asked me to do that. And one thing I did was get hold of Jerry and have him set up a special tea ceremony at the head school. I was hoping it would be with the master of the school, who was a real big shot in Kyoto. Iemoto. I think that just is a title for the head of the school. But I just heard him called Iemoto. But, we had like the head teacher, and that was neat. He was always in good shape, and we always thought he'd live to be old, but it says, alas, he got cancer and died. Yeah. Jerry had a humble approach. He never got ordained as a priest or pretended to know anything, but he always expressed himself thoroughly in his everyday life. He had a constancy and good humor that made him a real asset to the Sangha. Here, all right, so that's what I say. He says, I came to Zen Center in the fall of 1968 over on Bush Street. The first person I met was Tommy Dorsey, better known as Isan. I remember meeting Suzuki Roshi after morning zazen when everybody would go through his office in single file and gasho with him, and he used to do that with everybody. I always remember as being a smiling, interested man who was always trying to make contact with you. Oh, here's another place in his interview. He says, I went to lectures he gave when it seemed that he was directing it to me, to just what I was dealing with in my life. And then I'd talk to other people about it, and they'd say the same thing. It used to happen all the time with Suzuki Roshi. I think when you're practicing together as a group, a lot of us have the same focus, and the problems we're thinking about are similar. Maybe it was something psychic too, but I never thought that. It didn't seem important. He was very intuitive. He could look at a person who was trying to practice and see something. I can remember working at Tassajara when we were building the cabins up on the hill, and I was up in the rafters, and somebody was cutting 2x4s for blocking, and he came up there and just joined in and started passing them up to me. He used to do that sort of thing. He'd just come along and join in. He'd move these monstrous stones about, and he always had people working with him, and people thought he was magical, but he was just skilled. That's right. You know who said that? Nils, Jerry, Paul Disco. Look, 3 of the 4 Carpenters images, and probably Ken Sawyer would say it too. So Jerry Fuller's interview is on Cuke.com. You just write Jerry Fuller in the site search box. This has been a Cuke audio mini podcast. I'm DC Poobah of Cuke Archives and Cuke Audio, coming to you from sleepy Sanur with Dogga Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka. Wishing you and yours and all of us a grand awakening.